Writing a personal statement can be quite a daunting task, especially when you're not sure what to include in your statement or what it is that will make your personal statement stand out from the rest of them. And so in this video, I wanted to share some tips on how to do exactly that, what to include in your statement, what it is that will make the best personal statement, and I will also be sharing examples from my own personal statement, which got me into studying psychological and behavioural sciences at Cambridge. Today's video is going to be the second video in my series called The Student Diaries, where I share tips and advice from my time in education. This video is relevant for both those who haven't even started their statement, or for those who have already completed a draft or even their final statement, but are just figuring out how to make tweaks that will help level up that statement to make it the best it can be. And as usual, there are timestamps on this video, so you can always skip to the parts that you feel will be the most relevant to you. As I mentioned earlier, I studied psychology at university, and so the examples that I share in this video will be from my statement, which is obviously tailored towards a psychological and behavioural sciences course. But the tips I give in this video I feel are relevant to every subject. It's just up to you to then tweak and apply the tips I'm giving in this video for your specific subject. So to begin with, I just wanted to start with the basics. What is the purpose of a personal statement? Admissions tutors are essentially looking for two main things. One is that you are passionate about the course or the subject that you're applying for, and secondly, that you have the qualities or traits that will allow you to do well in the course. And so this is a really useful thing to keep in the back of your mind when you are writing your personal statement. Secondly, what do we want to include in the statement and how much do we need to write for each of these? The first thing that we want to include is why you want to apply specifically for the course that you're applying for, and if relevant, then what things you want to achieve with the course, maybe any plans that you have for what you want to do after you actually graduate. Now, of course, this isn't something that you have to include, but it's just some suggestions on things that you might want to include. And both of these things are great to incorporate in your introduction or conclusion paragraphs. Now, the majority of your statement, and I would say about 75% of what it is that you're writing, should be about what specifically interests you about the subject or course that you're applying for. So you need to show through your personal statement that you have a genuine interest in what it is that you're applying for. Now, this can be shown through relevant experiences that you've had, or maybe some reading or courses. These are just examples of how you can demonstrate that you have a genuine passion for your subject. And I will speak about this later on in the video, and specifically how you can take this to the next level by linking these things to your personal life or the world around you. The second part of the statement is the personal part of it. That is, what is it that makes you who you are? Things that you're interested in, your hobbies, your extracurricular activities. And a way to level this up even more is to write about these things in a way that showcase certain qualities or attributes that you have, which will be beneficial for you when you're on the course. And again, something which I will touch on in more detail later on in this video. You have 4,000 characters as a limit for your statement, which is around 500 to 550 words. And so really this is quite a small amount if you think about it. And so it's really important that you're able to be concise with how you write things, but also very selective about what it is that you want to talk about. And this leads me on to the next part of my video, which is all about preparation and planning. One of the best pieces of advice that I was given by my head of sixth form was to keep a log or diary of everything that I have done in the past or I'm doing throughout the year, which would be relevant to include in my personal statement. Now, this could be anything, like I mentioned, from any volunteering or extracurricular things that I've been doing, or any extra material that I've been reading beyond my specification for my subject. Literally anything which I feel like I could include in my personal statement. You could brainstorm or just log it down in a diary format, whatever format works for you, but I would include everything, even if you don't think it's impressive enough to be included in a statement. Because I would argue it's not necessarily what you're doing which is what's impressive. It's how you write about it, and it's what you take away from it and the value it's given you, and how you see your subject, which is actually the more important thing. And I will give examples of how I've actually done this in my statement as well later on in the video. Now after this, it can be really easy to try and cram everything and consolidate everything into your personal statement. But the key thing I want you to remember here is it's not necessarily about how much you cover in your personal statement, but actually more about how much you're able to expand on and develop some of the things you speak about in your statement. You could list 20 things about your subject that interest you, but if you're not able to explore that in depth in your personal statement, then it's not actually going to be saying much, because it's really easy to just list those things, but it takes a lot more interest and skill and passion to then be able to speak about a few things and go into a lot of depth and really explore those ideas. So one thing that I would really suggest is to be very selective about what points you're including, and there's two ways you can do this. The first thing is to actually go through all the things that you've logged or you've written about that you might want to include in your statement, and choose the ones that you feel like you have the most interesting things to say about, all the topics that you feel like you can expand on the most. The second thing you can use to decipher what you want to include in your statement is to actually look at some of the key things or prominent topics that come up in your course or subject, which you have some interesting opinions on or that you've done some extra reading on. For example, for me, research methods was such a prominent part of the psychology syllabus, but also the course that I'd applied for. And so when I learned some interesting things about eye tracking technology on a course that I did, I knew that that would be something which I want to include in my statement because it's such an important part of my course. Another thing that I think about during this planning phase is how I'm going to structure my paragraphs, or what points I'm going to include where and when in my statement. Because along with just what you're speaking about in your statement, admissions officers are obviously also going to be thinking about how clearly you're communicating these ideas and how structured your statement is. And so of course this is something which you can obviously tweak as you go along, as you do more drafts. But there's no harm in thinking about this also earlier on. So now that we've spoken about the purpose of the personal statement, how I would go about planning the statement, I wanted to discuss some tips on how you can go about writing. The first tip that I have, as I mentioned earlier, is to be specific and detailed. It's very standard for people to say, I'm really fascinated by this, I'm really interested in this, and then not go into enough detail about why specifically they're interested in something. It's really important that instead of just discussing loads of ideas, you hone in on one thing and really expand on it before you move on to the next. And I have an example of this. I'm really fascinated about cognitive biases. I read The Art of Thinking Clearly and found biases like the planning fallacy bias interesting. I was also captivated by the concept of memory. Even though this example has included further reading and things that you're interested in, it's not really saying much. You're kind of just saying that you're interested in something and then moving on to something else. And there's not really much of value in what's being said. But if you compare what I just read out to this, for example, I was first introduced to the concept of bias when learning about the experimental bias in the research methods part of the psychology specification. I was fascinated to learn how cognitive biases may influence my own decision making in everyday life, which led me to reading The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. Whilst reading the book, the planning fallacy bias taught me to give myself more time when scheduling my study sessions, as I acknowledged that my estimation of how long a task would take was influenced by an optimism bias. So as you can see, I've actually made a whole paragraph about just one point, which is about how I was interested about biases, and I went into a lot of detail. And this leads me on to my second tip for writing, which is really structure your paragraphs well. You want to make one central point and build on that in your paragraph. Now, it can be really difficult to know how to structure well in your personal statement, and I really want to caveat this point by saying that every personal statement is obviously going to be different, and everyone writes differently, and every subject has a different style of writing as well. So there's no really one set way to write a personal statement, and there's no one set structure that is the right way or that is the only way to do well in this personal statement. However, when I was writing my personal statement, I was given a structure which was very similar to the one that I'm about to share with you, that I used and found very helpful to just get me starting to write things, because it can be quite easy to be overwhelmed and just not start writing. So a structure can really help make that process a bit less daunting and give you some ideas and inspiration to how to express your interest and ideas in a solid way. So how I really built on this paragraph is I first started with picking something in my A-level course that I was genuinely interested in. And obviously if your course doesn't have like an A-level equivalent, or you've not taken an A-level in the subject that you're applying for, You can talk about anything, maybe something you've heard from the news, or just anything about your subject that interests you. And secondly, what I did was I spoke about what specifically it was that interests me. So in this example, I was introduced to biases in my A-level specification, but what specifically interested me about cognitive biases was how it influences our decision making. And so from here, I would give an example of how I went above and beyond my specification to research something about my subject. So in this case, I read The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. And lastly, I then gave an example of how I used what I'd learned to then apply my own life, or to see how it changed my view of the world around me. So you can apply this structure to your own subject or to any example that you wanted to speak about in your personal statement, and use this structure to really expand on what it is that you want to speak about. Writing your personal statement in this way really does require some self-reflection of thinking about what it is that genuinely interests you about your subject, and then how you've actually really gone above and beyond that and applied it in your own life. The next tip that I have for writing your personal statement is to show and not tell. It can be so easy for students to then list qualities that they have. You know, I'm really passionate about my subject, I'm organised, I'm responsible. All these beautiful qualities that you have, which you really want to put across in your personal statement, can be really effective because they're showing the admissions officer that you have characteristics that are going to make you successful in your course. But anyone can just list these characteristics. What you really want to do is demonstrate examples of how you've demonstrated this. And this is a great thing to tie into your personal aspect of the statement. All the extracurricular things that you do, or hobbies and skill sets that you have that you want to speak about in your personal statement, are a great way to demonstrate some of these characteristics and traits that you feel you have that will make you suitable for your course. So here's a paragraph for my personal statement where I feel like I've done this at the very beginning of my paragraph. Along with my 4 A-levels and being the head girl of my 6th form, I had a weekend job teaching young children Gujarati. Now, even though I go on to speak about psychological theories and things like that, because it was really relevant here to bring in my subject, just the first line is demonstrating my ability to be organised and hardworking, to be able to balance all these different things. And these are all traits that are useful and will aid me in my time at university. And so even though I've not explicitly said that I'm all of these things, I've almost implied it in the way that I've written things in my statement. So for the last part of this video, I just wanted to share some general tips which I found useful when writing my statement. At first, I would really advise ignoring the word count, because when you're first trying to write things, you want to just write as much as you can and get as much creativity and ideas and inspiration as you can. And then at the end, when you feel like you've written enough, you can then start going back and start refining, or maybe making things a bit more concise so that you're able to fit everything in. The second tip that I have is to actually start writing as soon as possible. It can be really easy to put this off and feel a bit lost and not know where to start. But you just have to remind yourself, if you're having issues with starting because you're being very perfectionist about it, that it's just your first draft. Writing something is so much better than having a blank page and feeling intimidated. So if you have an idea, even if you don't think it's good enough, just get your ideas onto the paper and start getting things together. And over time, if you start earlier, you then have time to refine it and do a couple of drafts to finally get to the point where you want to be. I found it really useful to write a draft, take some space, maybe get some feedback, and then maybe try and refine it later on. And taking space means that you're able to see what you've written from fresh eyes, and over time you may even get more ideas and inspiration as you go along. So there's so much benefit to starting your personal statement earlier and then refining it as the months go on. I personally really struggled with the introduction, and I think that most students find that. It's the part that's the hardest, because it's so easy to make your introduction cliche or standard, and to write a unique introduction that you still feel is authentic and genuine to who you are is something which I found really difficult. And so taking that time to have multiple drafts and also get feedback on it was quite helpful for me. And at the end of the day, if you're struggling between what to include, what not to include, what introduction to go for, or what advice to listen to, the key thing that I always remember is your personal statement has to be personal to you. And again, that does sound quite cliche, but especially if it's something which you're going to be interviewed for, if you're applying for like Oxbridge, for example, or medicine, it's so important that you write something that you feel is authentic to you, because then when you're questioned on it, you're not going to be as thrown off in the interview because you genuinely meant what you wrote. Specifically with introduction, I would say that if you're really putting a lot of pressure on yourself, tell yourself that you can write multiple introductions, and then over time, after getting some feedback and refining, you will eventually come to an introduction that you find is genuinely interesting to you. I had written so many different introductions and I really struggled with picking, and I'm really happy that I eventually chose the one that I felt like was the most true to me. Another thing that I would say is that it can be quite useful to get multiple people to read your drafts or your personal statement. When you have your final personal statement, I would always go and run that through maybe your English teacher to just make sure things are flowing smoothly. I would also make use of your subject teacher. So I gave my statement to my psychology teacher and he gave me some really useful suggestions and also gave me an interesting counter theory that I included in my statement, which really gave it that extra edge and that advantage because he had that awareness of the subject. And obviously if you're applying for a course which you haven't done an A-level in, then just choosing the teacher in your school that probably is the closest linked to that subject and giving that statement to them and asking them to review it is such a great way to get some useful feedback that can give you that extra push. Lastly, I would give it to a teacher or anyone who just doesn't know me, and getting feedback from a person who's not going to have a biased view of my statement, because obviously the admissions officer or tutor, whoever's reading your statement, doesn't know you. But one thing that I'd be quite selective about is how many people you're giving your statement to, because you can find yourself getting so much feedback from multiple people and ultimately it's just someone else's personal opinion about how you can improve your statement. So I would give yourself freedom to maybe reject advice which you don't agree with or that doesn't feel authentic to you, and also just not giving your statement to too many people because it can be quite overwhelming to know what advice to follow and what not to. So just be really selective about giving your statement to people who you trust and whose feedback you genuinely value. And the last thing is AI. When I was writing my personal statement, we didn't have like ChatGPT or AI to go to at the time. But obviously now it can be quite useful to use AI as prompts. And I'd be very careful about how I'm using AI to write my personal statement, because your personal statement is, again, as the name suggests, personal. And so if you are obviously getting AI to generate the majority of your statement, although it may sound better than anything you can produce, really that's not what the admissions officers are looking for, because they're obviously going to be able to tell when something is AI generated and not something which is genuine. They read thousands and thousands of personal statements every year, and so I would be very selective about using AI to prompt different ideas, especially in the brainstorming phase where you're planning and thinking about maybe how you can go into more depth about something that you've read, or maybe even getting recommendations for reading. Like, AI can be very useful. ChatGPT can be very useful as prompts, as aids, but I would never use AI to then generate and actually write your whole personal statement or a massive chunk of it. Especially if you're going to be interviewed as part of your application, it's so important that you genuinely know what sources you've cited, what books you've included, that you've genuinely read them, because the admissions officers do genuinely question you and expect you to be able to answer these things which you've included. And obviously all the things that I've spoken about in this video are just suggestions and things that I felt like have worked for me, from my experience of writing a personal statement, and the things that I felt is what made my personal statement stand out. But obviously there are so many different ways to approach writing your personal statement and so many different things that you could include. And so this video is more of my opinion, and so please take everything that I've said with a pinch of salt and apply the things that you feel like you want to apply or that you agree with. By no means is this the only way to write a really strong personal statement. It is just how I went about my process of writing a personal statement. I will also include my personal statement in the description below if you want to look at it for some inspiration. But good luck with writing your personal statement. And if you enjoyed this video, you might like to check out my student diary series over here. I have a video about all the advice that I'd wish I'd got given before I went to university. But I hope you found this video useful, and let me know in the comments below if there is anything that you'd like to see from me, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.